When it's to actually learn requires some basic values, and they don't seem. I don't even blame the students. I blame the faculties and the presidents. So few of them are willing to stand up to defend the institutions that they run. And we saw this in the Vietnam War too. Think of the protests. The protests, the most violent, were at universities where there was probably more support for the anti-war movement than there was in the regular country.
Dan, could this possibly be something of a cultural turning point? Do you think if people see that at the University of Missouri and at Evergreen that there are real consequences for the allowing disorder to break out and dominate over education?
It possibly could be, Paul. As Jillian reported, there are some people thinking of sending their children to Evergreen who then self-identify as people of the left, but say they're not signing up for something like this sort of chaos. And I will say, very interestingly, Paul, the Washington Post had a poll this week in which 50% of the people polled said that they think demonstrations today are more violent and more unruly than they were 50 years ago, and they don't like it. So I think the kind of just chaos that progressives are creating at places like Evergreen are being noticed around the country, and people are recoiling from it.
Jillian, what do you think is going to happen going forward at Evergreen?
I think they're in real trouble. It's been interesting talking to different students who had considered Evergreen, crossed it off their list. 1/3 of the students in one poll I looked at said that they were terrified of academic mobbing. So I think this university is in trouble.
Great. Thank you, Jillian. And catch her podcast at WSJ.com, 30 minutes on what happened at Evergreen. We have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week. Bill.
Mine goes to Betty Crocker. Someone tweeted a complaint about the use of genetically modified ingredients in their formulas, and they, instead of caving to bad science and so forth, they defended themselves, saying we're all about safety, and they pointed to scientific organizations that backed them up. So good for a company for not caving in.
All right, Jillian.
My hit of the week is tough love from parents who evicted their son in court. He was 30 years old and refused to leave. But
to leave their home.
Yeah, he wouldn't get out. So there's a redemptive twist to this story. An Italian restaurant has just offered him a job. So if he wants to stand on his own as a 30-year-old, now's his chance.
Any word on whether he took it?
No word yet.
All right, Dan.
Paul, I'm giving my hit, believe it or not, to the U.S. Congress, which this week passed right-to-try legislation, which gives seriously ill patients, allows the Food and Drug Administration and drug companies to give seriously ill patients access to experimental drugs. It's far from an ideal law, but it makes significant progress on a battle that goes back 30 years. President Trump deserves credit for pushing right-to-try legislation, and he says he's going to sign it this week.
You know, Bill, I love my parents, and they were great, but I have to tell you, when I was 22, I was out the door, man.
They wouldn't have paid that Dartmouth bill, right?
Well, I didn't want to go back, and they didn't want me to go back. Right. All right, and remember, if you have your own hit or miss, be sure to tweet it to us at JER on FNC. That's it for this week's show. Thanks to my panel. Thanks to all of you for watching. I'm Paul Gigot. We hope to see you right here next week.
And this is a Fox News alert. New signs that a planned U.S.-North Korea summit might be back on track as U.S. officials cross into the north to lay down the groundwork. President Trump saying talks over a potential June 12th summit with Kim Jong-un are progressing well. Both sides pressing ahead with plans despite the uncertainty hanging over that meeting. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new hour inside America's News headquarters. I'm Arthel Neville. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Arthel.
Hi.
And I'm Mike Emanuel, in for Eric Shawn. The two leaders raising fresh hopes of sitting face-to-face in Singapore and possibly ending decades of mutual hostility. But on Capitol Hill, some lawmakers are not convinced that the North Korean leader will live up to his promises.
Can he really get rid of them? Because this is a man who has to figure out how to survive in power for 50-something years as a dictator, and is probably afraid that if he gets rid of these weapons, at some point, someone's going to take him out. The North Koreans ghosted us here for about 2 weeks after all this happened. We didn't hear from them. There was no talk. If they keep doing that stuff, you're really wasting your time, and more importantly, perhaps elevating them in a way that makes this situation even more dangerous.
Ellison Barber is live at the White House now with the very latest. Ellison?
Arthel, the meeting is not officially back on, but the preparations for it certainly are. A U.S. team is near the north-south border right now. In a statement, the spokesperson for the State Department told Fox News, quote, a U.S. delegation is in ongoing talks with North Korean officials at Panmunjom. We continue to prepare for a meeting between the president and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Here's President Trump in the Oval Office yesterday.
People want to see if we can get the meeting and get something done. If we got that done and if we can be successful in the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. A lot of people are working on it. It's moving along very nicely. So we're looking at June 12th in Singapore. That hasn't changed. And it's moving along pretty well. So we'll see what happens.
On Capitol Hill, there seems to be a fair amount of skepticism. This past week, some lawmakers say more preparations need to go into this meeting.
It's right out of the North Korean playbook. We're into 3 generations of that playbook now. Act like you want to negotiate, then come up with some outlandish view of what that negotiation means and try to wind up with early benefits to your side and not following through on what you've agreed to do. There needs to be a strong understanding of what both sides, what all 3 sides, frankly, mean by denuclearization.
It's important that North Korea has given up a number of American prisoners as a confidence-building measure. But let's be clear. Twice before, North Korea, under Kim Jong-un's father, committed to full denuclearization in 6-party talks in 2005 and 2007, as Senator Blunt just referenced, only to then change their tune.
We and other members of the press were in the Oval Office with President Trump last night at about 8:45 p.m. He said at that moment, in regards to North Korea, there were meetings taking place. They were happening not far from here. Arthel?
Ellison Barber, thank you, Ellison. Mike?
Arthel, meanwhile, on the Korean Peninsula, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, insisting Kim remains committed to the summit and complete denuclearization following their surprise second meeting yesterday. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott is in Seoul, South Korea, with more.
Mike, more surprises along the DMZ, maybe a breakthrough in the works regarding a possible summit involving President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Just one day after the North Korean leader Kim met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in along the DMZ, the north side of the border, the State Department is now confirming that U.S. and North Korean officials are meeting basically at the same location to thrash out issues ahead of the proposed summit. Among those reportedly involved, the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, Sung Kim. The Korean American is a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea, a former U.S. nuclear negotiator with the North. And on the North Korean side, the powerful Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sung-hui. She is best known recently for being behind last week's statement dubbing Vice President Pence a political dummy, which for a moment at least had President Trump calling off the talks. For now, they could be back on. Comments coming on Sunday here from South Korean President Moon, probably encouraging. He said in his meeting with the North Korean leader, Kim said that he is determined to hold the summit with President Trump on June 12th, committed to complete denuclearization. With some reservations, though, Kim reportedly also said he still had concerns about security assurances he was getting from the United States regarding his regime. And the South Korean president admitted there are still differences of opinions as to what denuclearization really means. That presumably could be worked out in these talks along the DMZ, said to be going on Monday and Tuesday as well. There's also an advance team in Singapore preparing for a possible meeting. Busy times in the region. Mike.
Greg Palcott, thanks very much. Arthel?
All right, Mike, well, for more on this, we're going to bring in former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, now the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. Ambassador, good to have you here.
Thank you.
Great, here we are. It looks like the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un back on for June 12th in Singapore. Now, based on the comments that he made to South Korean President Moon Jae-in in a surprise meeting Saturday, Kim Jong-un remains, he says he remains committed to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the end of the Korean War. Can he be trusted?
I think you just have to try and then see whether we can come up with a deal that is real and verifiable and implemented. The alternative is not to do that, and that's far worse. So I think it is worth trying and seeing what we can do. These are encouraging statements, but of course, North Korea, as was pointed out, has been encouraging in the past, only to backtrack. So let's see what happens this time.
Now, present day, though, what do you think would be Kim Jong-un's motivation to follow through with proposed commitments?
Yeah, there are a couple things. First off, I think the North Korean economy and the situation of the country itself is much weaker than many observers imagine. So there is a sustainability factor for the country internally. Second, it's what was referenced here about security guarantees, the idea that there won't be an external effort to change the regime. I think that's also very important to him. And then third, I think he does relish the spotlight of being there with President Trump. And I think President Trump is wisely trying to use that in order to see whether we can get real commitments or not.
And also perhaps his legacy. I mean, he could be, the one who changes course of things where his grandfather or father didn't.
That's an optimistic notion. I agree. If people thought that way, that would be historic and significant. But who knows? Let's just stay focused on exactly what it is that we're trying to agree on and see whether we can do it.
And that's still a little fuzzy because already the president, President Trump, saying, listen, there could be varying definitions of what complete denuclearization would look like.
That's true, but I think it's very important that the U.S. have clear goals in its mind. We've been at this a long time. We know that we can't live with the nuclear arms, North Korea pointing its weapons at the United States and threatening allies in the region as well. So we know what we need to get out of this. It's worth just trying to see whether we can have the meeting, we can create a discussion. If there are ways to provide some assurance to North Korea, there are probably ways we can do that. But ultimately, we've got to make sure that we reach an understanding that we believe matters for what denuclearization means.
And do you have an idea of what that means in terms of what we believe?
I think it's better to leave that to the people in the room. Okay. I think there are some options here that you can think about, but I don't want to prejudge how they're looking at that.
Fair enough. So, listen, if the leaders of the Koreas are cooperating, you've got China helping the U.S. with pressure on Pyongyang and circumventing a trade war with the U.S., thus easing some of the strain on the U.S.-China relations. What about Japan? I mean, don't they have a role in the region?
They do. They certainly have a role. They are very concerned also about North Korea's missile and nuclear capabilities. Missiles have gone over Japan. And they also have a difficult but effective relationship with South Korea, and they have an opportunity, actually, to be a constructive regional player. But ultimately, China is the country that has the most influence on North Korea. So getting China's support for this effort and China's pressure on North Korea is, in fact, critical for bringing this to a conclusion, if it can be done.
So that means Japan right now kind of stays on the secondary tier of this
and is prepared to defend itself and is prepared to join the political pressure on North Korea. But the leverage on North Korea, if you will, particularly economically, that's going to come from China.
Well, Ambassador Volker, as you know, everybody's watching, the world is watching. What is the impression on the world stage as international allies and foes watch all of this unfold?
Well, a lot of people are just holding their breath. As you know, there's a lot of skepticism about President Trump around the world, and yet he has managed to flip this from being tweets about Rocket Man to being an actual negotiation about denuclearization and a possible meeting at a summit level. People are quite surprised by that. Obviously, everyone wants to see it be successful, so now you see people just holding their breath and, waiting and seeing how this is going to play out.
And it does appear that most people want to see this succeed in some shape or form.
Yeah.
Is there anyone on the international stage sort of hiding behind the bushes, hoping the negotiations between the U.S. and North Korea ultimately fail?
Well, I think Iran finds it a great distraction from its own issues with the United States. So maybe Iran is hoping that it'll be prolonged. But apart from that, you look at countries in the region, you look at China, you look at Europeans, United States, everyone would like to see North Korea free of its nuclear weapons and creating a long-term peace, not just an armistice, but a real peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Take care.
Former President George H.W. Bush has been hospitalized in Maine for low blood pressure and fatigue. A spokesman for Mr. Bush tweeting President George H.W. Bush was taken to Southern Maine Health Care today After experiencing low blood pressure and fatigue, he will likely remain there for a few days for observation. The former president is awake and alert and not in any discomfort. The 41st president was recently hospitalized in Houston for an infection that spread to his blood. And we send our thoughts and prayers and best wishes for a speedy recovery.
Yes, let's hope he gets fully recovered. And they come from all over the country to pay tribute to our veterans and honor the fallen. Thousands of bikers revving their engines for Rolling Thunder. More on the big event in D.C. is straight ahead. Plus, President Trump calling the Russia investigation, quote, rigged. Now his personal lawyer railing against Robert Mueller's probe amid controversy over alleged surveillance of the Trump campaign. And a community divided as a long-standing gun show takes its final bow. A needed change or infringement on Second Amendment rights? We'll talk about it.
The loss of this show will probably put about a 10% dent in my show business, my show revenue for the entire year.
Well, this holiday weekend marks the end of a decades-long tradition in Saratoga Springs, New York. After more than 30 years, the city has hosted its final gun show. The Saratoga Springs City Council voted unanimously to ban gun sales on city-owned property, forcing gun shows to move to private venues. Gun dealers say this will have a big impact on the city's bottom line.
I feel that it's a terrible ending. We should still be allowed to be here. We've made a lot of friends, a lot of money up here, brought in a lot of money to Saratoga.
The annual show brought thousands of people to the area each year. One city leader says that between prior incidents and community reaction to recent mass shootings, the council had no choice but to pass the ban.
President Trump calling out Democrats on Twitter, asking why they didn't investigate Hillary Clinton's campaign, as he continues putting pressure on the Justice Department to investigate claims the FBI improperly spied on his 2016 campaign. Now, the word spy has been a key point of contention, with some lawmakers insisting a confidential informant is not a spy. Listen to what Mr. Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said on Fox News Sunday when asked what was wrong with Robert Mueller trying to figure out what Russia was up to.
Nothing wrong with the government doing that. Everything wrong with the government spying on a candidate of the opposition party. That's a Watergate, a Spygate. I mean, and without any warning to him.
On the other side, Democratic Senator Chris Coons sees it very differently.
A critical role that the FBI provides is counterintelligence. And when they began getting evidence that the Russians were engaged in a broad campaign to try and influence the 2016 election, I think it was appropriate for them to use a confidential informant to investigate what the Russians were up to.
Joining me now is former federal prosecutor Fred Teesey. Fred, good to see you.
Hey, Mike, thanks for having me.
What about this battle over terminology, spy versus confidential informant?
You know, it's all a matter of logistics. I mean, you know, one person's spy is another person's mole, is another person's confidential informant. You know, the question is whether or not the FBI engaged in conduct where they had people talking to a campaign for someone who was running for president of the United States. And then this kind of stuff all will play out ultimately, you know, whether or not that was part of the Russian investigation. I mean, that was kind of the story that was kind of cooked up. Unfortunately, the timeline doesn't quite match up with, you know, when these confidential informants were asked to go in and when they got the evidence about the so-called Russian collusion. So we'll see.
Rudy Giuliani told Fox News Sunday that Robert Mueller's investigation is a witch hunt and not based on facts. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, that's his job, right? I mean, we see this president, we talked about him earlier, how he postured, called the head of North Korea a rocket man, and now he's talking about denuclearization. I mean, I think part of what Mr. Giuliani's doing is he's kind of taken, I don't want to say bombastic, but I'll use it for lack of a better term. And then ultimately there's going to be a negotiation because Mr. Giuliani or some of Trump's lawyers are going to have to sit down with Robert Mueller at some point and decide what's the boundaries? What are we going to talk about? When Mr. Mueller wants to talk to the president, which I think ultimately he'll be able to do, you know, that's kind of a negotiation, and I think what you're seeing is the first salvos for that.
So speaking of that, there's been a lot of discussion about if President Trump will sit down with Robert Mueller and the scope of that conversation. What's your expectation?
Well, my expectation is that scope will be negotiated, and I don't think that the president's people can negotiate away talking about Russian quote-unquote collusion such as it is, all right? But I think if at one point, if Mr. Mueller wants to talk to President Trump about obstruction having anything to do with the removal of James Comey, I think that he's got a lot of hoops to jump through to get to that. He's got to show that somehow President Trump engaged in some type of conduct that could constitute obstruction, that he corruptly impeded an investigation, that he has specific intent to do it. So I think Trump's lawyers are going to smartly kind of really draw a line in the sand and stop any type of questions along that unless Mueller comes up with a lot more than what we've seen.
So in your view, did Jim Comey serve at the pleasure of the president, and the president had every right to dismiss him as FBI director?
Well, it's not my view, it's the law. Right? He's the head of the executive branch. He's entitled to remove the head of the FBI. The statute for obstruction means it has to be corruptly. You know, when I was a federal prosecutor, I prosecuted federal officials for obstruction of justice and for perjury in front of the grand jury. These are very difficult crimes to prove. You have to prove that he knew that there was an investigation. There's 1,000 things that have to happen. He could lawfully remove Comey. I think to be able to establish an obstruction charge on that is weak at best, and I don't see that going anywhere, in my humble opinion.
And so if they do sit down with Robert Mueller, the focus of that discussion should be?
Well, the focus should be, okay, whatever it was that Mueller was ultimately entitled to do. Remember, Mueller's a special prosecutor, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like when I was a prosecutor. I was allowed to investigate any violation of any federal criminal law. When a special prosecutor is appointed, there's a memo, and we know it's being reviewed by a federal judge, and it sets forth kind of the boundaries for where Mueller can go. I'm assuming that that's broad enough to include Russian collusion, and I think that was what the president's lawyers will negotiate, and that's what will get discussed.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to see how that all plays out. Fred Tisi, former federal prosecutor, many thanks for your time, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Barthel?
Okay, Mike. Bikers hitting the streets in Washington today to honor the men and women who served our country and to remember those who never returned home. How today's Ride for Freedom made history. And the head of a Border Patrol union clarifying some controversial comments, calling one of President Trump's actions to protect the border a, quote, colossal waste of time.
Nobody praised the president more than I did in any media that I know of for the decision to send the National Guard. But if you look at the DHS response to what I said, I mean, they even admitted that this deployment is not being used the same as it has been used in the past.
There is a lot of adrenaline with being a journalist. I think it's one of the things that drew us to the business. You want to be well informed so that whenever news breaks, you're ready to tackle it. I think the nighttime hours are invaluable. The fact that we've
saying, quote, our United Nations or United States team has arrived in North Korea to make arrangements for the summit between Kim Jong-un and myself. I truly believe North Korea has brilliant potential and will be a great economic and financial nation one day. Kim Jong-un agrees with me on this. It will happen. More developments as they come.
Rolling Thunder's Ride for Freedom taking place in our nation's capital today. Thousands of bikers hitting the streets for the big event honoring military veterans and remembering those who never came home. Garrett Tenney is on the National Mall in Washington.
Mike, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more patriotic crowd of people on Memorial Day weekend than here at Rolling Thunder. You have folks from all over the country. They are veterans, Gold Star families, and a whole lot of proud Americans. This is no parade, though. Organizers are quick to say this is a demonstration, and their mission is the same it was 31 years ago when this event started. Raise awareness of our soldiers who never came home and are still missing in action.
These men and women have fought for the rights of all of us so that we can live free the way we do, and our government has a war just as involved, and they leave our men and women behind after a war.
When Mueller started this, there was no Twitter or Facebook, no going viral, but their goal was to hold a demonstration so loud that lawmakers couldn't ignore them. A few 100,000 motorcycles will certainly do that. President Trump took notice this morning, tweeting in part, "Fantastic to have 400,000 great men and women of Rolling Thunder in D.C., showing their patriotism. They love our country. They love our flag. They stand for our national anthem." Organizers estimate more than 1 million riders and spectators took part in today's Ride for Freedom, which they're billing as the world's largest single-day motorcycle event. And next year, just like every year before, they're expecting it will be even bigger. Mike?
Garrett Tenney, thanks very much.
Well, tensions rising in the South China Sea. American warships spotted near a chain of disputed islands today. China lays claim on those islands and says the U.S. move is a violation of its sovereignty. All this happening just days after China landed nuclear-capable bombers and deployed missiles to one of the islands. Jessie Jane Duff is a retired gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps and senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research. Good to have you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
It's pretty serious from where I sit, but you're the expert. How big of a threat is this situation in the South China Sea, where Beijing wants to diminish the U.S. Navy's dominance and take control of the waters?
Well, of course, it's a threat to our national security. They have taken over this area that has been essentially disputed region. And not only that, they have brought in missile launchers that they have been trying to camouflage, literally, when we have aerial photos. They've also landed a nuclear-capable bomber on one of the islands. We see that they have been ramping up for some time. This is nothing new. But our United States Navy, in its magnificent form that it maintains, is traveling throughout the international waters and patrolling that region on a regular basis. The threat will be minimized very quickly by our Navy if the Chinese government decides to pose any additional threat to our security or our allies.
But does that put us on the brink of a war there?
I think our country is always on some brink of an international crisis. Let's just be realistic about this. Freedom is always being grappled by dictators throughout the world. They always want to take a piece of it away. And so this is always something that why our military must always be ready. Our military must be strong and it must be forceful. And if we have a command presence throughout the world, they know that we mean business and they will be not as tempted to try to overreach those boundaries.
So I just want to be clear that I'm certainly not trying to incite our viewers, but I want to be clear that you're saying that this current situation, which on paper looks pretty ominous, you're saying it's not really as big of a deal.
Well, I wouldn't suggest that it's not a big deal. I think that we just need to be vigilant. That is the motto that we always maintain in the military. Particularly those on active duty are very aware that you maintain a force of readiness at all times. There is no time to sleep when you're on active duty. You must always be present throughout the world simply because when you turn the other way, governments like China will take advantage of that lackadaisical mindset.
Meanwhile, strong efforts forging ahead towards a denuclearized Korean peninsula. What's the impact on the U.S. military, if any?
Well, you know, I am very, very optimistic yet skeptical at the same time because, see, Kim Jong-un, his life insurance policy is in those weapons. Without his fierce control of his own people, he also risks being overthrown. So I'm hopeful that the president has some magic way in convincing him to denuclearize. But the reality is I don't expect that our military would ever leave South Korea, not anytime soon for any reason. The North Koreans cannot be trusted. They make a project out of destroying their own people. They have no regard for human life. So why would we expect that to be any different once he denuclearizes?
So let's talk about the state of the U.S. military overall concerning budget, equipment, personnel, and just overall readiness. What's your assessment?
Well, the Heritage Foundation came out in October that our military was not at its peak of readiness, and that was due to large percentage of the sequestration that we endured. There's approximately about $100 billion that were cut from our budget up to 2015. With that said, it kept a lot of the military from being combat ready. Approximately 70% of some of the fighting forces within the Navy and the Marine Corps were incapable of fighting in ground combat, or in combat, air combat, I should say. The brigades in the Army also suffered a massive incapability under the sequestration, along with the Air Force. Every branch of service suffered. However, with this new budget that the military has insisted upon being able to push forward, they were awarded this recently with the passage of the budget, and hopefully we're going to see a mass force of readiness increase, an uptick. I'm optimistic. It is definitely not where it needs to be as of right now, but we are on a fast way of improvement soon.
Okay. Sergeant Duff, I want to thank you for being here, but as I mentioned, you're a gunnery sergeant with the U.S. Marine Corps, and if you would, before you go, would you share your thoughts and emotions on this Memorial Day weekend?
I think it's just a very heartfelt weekend that we all must remember that only 1% of this nation serves. And not very many people even know a veteran, let alone somebody who had died on active duty. But the greatest sacrifice that you can do for anyone is to fall for your brother, and let alone our military is willing to defend those they have never met. That is the ultimate sacrifice. So while you're out this weekend, take the time to remember those who served that had died for our freedom.
Absolutely. Sergeant Duffin, thank you for your service as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
A new controversy brewing over immigration. The president of the National Border Patrol Union is now seeking to clarify some controversial comments after he said that the National Guard's deployment was a, quote, colossal waste of time. Marianne Rafferty is live in our West Coast newsroom with the new developments. Marianne?
Well, hi, Mike. Thousands of Guard troops have headed to the southern U.S. border since President Trump made the order last month. Now, the head of the National Border Patrol Union is clarifying those recent comments he made. Brandon Judd, president of the National Border Patrol Council, told Fox and Friends this morning that statements made to the L.A. Times saying agents have, quote, seen no benefit to having Guard troops on the border were taken out of context.
I was talking about the deployment of our current Border Patrol resources, and if we were deploying those resources correctly, would we actually need the National Guard? The National Guard has been a huge benefit to the Border Patrol in the past, and we expected it to be a benefit again for us this time around.
Judd went on to say that the current deployment of National Guard troops is being handled differently than previous border deployments, and the union president says that's led to a poor use of resources. Now a National Guard troop must be paired with a Border Patrol agent who has law enforcement powers.
When we have the National Guard there, they've been in our lookout and observation posts. They've been in our static positions. They've been in our control room. And what they do is they free up those resources that otherwise have to do those jobs to allow us to go out and patrol the border.
So far, more than 1,600 National Guard troops have deployed to the borders of Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas, assisting with over 4,000 deportations. And they've also turned back more than 1,000 people trying to penetrate our borders illegally. Now, according to Pentagon officials, the number of Guard troops assisting at the border could swell to 4,000 in the coming months. Mike?
Marianne Rafferty reporting. Marianne, many thanks. Arthel?
Mike, thank you. And we're going to get new reaction on the immigration debate as a group of Republican lawmakers try to force Congress to resolve the DACA issue. What lies ahead on the immigration battle after the holiday break? That's coming up.
Also, Gulf Coast states bracing for impact as subtropical storm Alberto inches toward the region. How local leaders are taking on life-threatening rip current conditions. Plus, preparations underway for the possibility of mass evacuations on Hawaii's Big Island as the erupting Kilauea volcano becomes more unpredictable.
Volcano has now crossed into a geothermal power plant on the Big Island. Authorities fearing the release of toxic gases if molten rock comes into contact with the wells. Residents remain on high alert, preparing to evacuate at a moment's notice.
The battle over immigration is heating up on Capitol Hill as a group of Republican lawmakers are now only a few signatures away from forcing a debate on 4 competing DACA proposals. House Freedom Caucus Chairman Mark Meadows says there is real bipartisan support for immigration reform.
I think that even in some of the more conservative bills that have been talked about, there is the ability to become citizens. And so that's the narrative that's not really out there. The most important thing is to secure our southern border so that we don't have to deal with this problem a decade from now, 2 decades from now. And I think we're well on our way to doing that.
Joining me now is Haley Britsky, a reporter for Axios. Haley, nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Is it safe to say almost everyone wants to tackle immigration, but there are very different views in terms of what lawmakers want?
That's exactly right. I mean, immigration has been an issue for months now, right? So we have Republicans and Democrats who just want to get this behind them. They want to decide on something, whatever that may be, and they're ready to move forward. So especially with the midterms coming up, this is a big issue that constituents want to hear an answer on, and they want it soon.
What about opening up this very difficult issue in June, 5 months before elections, when the entire House and 1/3 of the United States Senate will be up for grabs?
Right. So that is something that candidates are going to be talking about, you know, on the campaign trail. They're going to be wanting to give answers to their constituents on where they stand on this. And of course, you have Republicans like House Speaker Paul Ryan, who is pushing against this DACA petition that would make DACA law. You have President Trump, who certainly is opinionated about this issue. And that's going to be something that candidates really weigh in on.
How alarmed do you think conservatives in the House Freedom Caucus are about moderates signing that discharge petition and working with Democrats?
That's something that I really think they are concerned about. You know, like I said, House Speaker Paul Ryan has been pushing really strongly against that. He wants a vote on his terms, and he suggested that President Trump probably won't sign this anyway. So, but that's something I think that signals to the greater, you know, message of we want to get something done on this now. We've been talking about it for too long, and they're ready to force a vote.
If the Democrats and moderates pass a plan addressing the so-called Dreamers, which is perhaps light on security, the question, of course, is will the president even sign it?
I mean, I don't think anyone should be in the business of trying to predict what this president will do, right? But it's something that he will definitely want to hear from people around him. And one of the voices that's going to be closest to him is Paul Ryan, who has been against this from the start. So that's something the president will definitely take into consideration.
And it's interesting listening to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's not giving up much in terms of his next play, noting the Senate spent an entire week on immigration and struck out. And it sounds like he doesn't want to waste more time on a plan that perhaps President Trump doesn't want, right?
Right. I mean, as you can imagine, it's kind of frustrating when you're there working so heavily on something and then the president doesn't accept it and the president, you know, has problems with that. So Mitch McConnell definitely has a fight ahead of him. He's going to have to decide where he falls on this. And I'm sure he'll be doing a lot of talking with the president as this gets closer to a vote.
All right. Well, Haley Britsky from Axios, thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, you too.
Arthel?
Mike, thank you. The first named storm of the 2018 hurricane season getting closer to land. Alberto on the move towards Florida and the Gulf Coast as people there brace for impact. We're live on the ground with the very latest coming up next. This Memorial Day weekend, as subtropical storm Alberto is picking up steam on its way towards the region, threatening hazardous storm surge and flooding. Jonathan Seri is live in Pensacola, Florida with more. And Jonathan, looks like the calm before the storm somewhat there.
It is indeed. The winds are slowly beginning to pick up. We haven't seen much in the form of rain, just a few drops appearing on my iPhone here, but not enough to keep people away from the beach. In fact, many visitors out here enjoying the beach, not many venturing into the water, though. Lifeguards have been driving up and down the beach, keeping people out of the water, putting up red flags, warning people to stay out of the water. They don't even want people wading in the Gulf of Mexico as this storm is approaching, because there is potential for very dangerous surf and rip currents. Nevertheless, this even though this is falling, this storm is approaching on one of the busiest holiday weekends for this part of Florida. Many vacationers say they're not going to let this ruin their holiday. Take a listen.
I checked the weather out before we came down, and if anything moves in, we're prepared to head out and maybe take a detour and take in a museum or something like that.
How about you? Are you worried at all?
Not really. I really want to be out on the water though, because that's what we came for, but if we don't, that's fine. We can always do indoor activities.
It's Florida. I mean, the weather's always changing out here. It can be storming one second and then be beautiful another second.
So you're not too worried?
Nah, not at all.
Yeah, so although the winds from this storm are not expected to reach hurricane force, one thing that forecasters are worried about is the potential of Alberto to become a major rain event, causing flash flooding in low-lying areas, including some places far inland. Remember, it was another tropical storm also named Alberto back in 1994 that made landfall in the Florida Panhandle with little fanfare, but then parked itself over central Georgia. Rain from that storm caused historic river flooding from Macon in the center of the state all the way down to Bainbridge in the southwestern corner. And as you can see from that video that we just ran, plenty of rain in other parts of Florida, including the Miami area. So emergency management officials are urging residents and visitors alike not to take this storm for granted. Even though it's not going to be as strong or as windy as a hurricane, it does have the potential to cause some spotty flooding. They warn you that if you're driving along and you see some standing water in the road, turn around, don't take any chances. That water can be deceptively deep. Arthel?
That's for sure, and flooding can be very devastating. You know, and I was listening to the soundbite you had with those visitors that they're saying, listen, it's the weekend, the long weekend. I'm going to be out there on that beach. Wondering if the U.S. Coast Guard has placed extra lifeguards on hand, since a lot of people are determined to be out there.
And not only do we have the municipal lifeguards with Pensacola and Escambia County out here patrolling the beach, but the Coast Guard is also beefing up these efforts. These guys work in some of the most treacherous conditions by boat and by helicopter, fishing people who become stranded out in the water. Really heroic efforts, and they're making those efforts available in this storm. Hopefully they won't be needed, but all too many times they are, Arthel.
Okay, Jonathan Seri, thank you so much there in Pensacola, Florida.
It is a small symbol of a major sacrifice. Every year, the American Legion hands out hundreds of thousands of handmade poppies in honor of our veterans. Carrie Cavanaugh from our Boston affiliate WFXT introduces us to one woman who's putting her hands to work for those who served.
When the train starts humming,
just start going.
A regular commuter begins her regular routine.
I can almost do it without even looking at them. On the train, on the plane, wherever I go, I sit there and make them. I'm Ann Fournier, and I'm the Poppy Lady.
Ann Fournier says she's had the nickname the Poppy Lady for about 30 years. That's how long she's been hand-making poppies for the American Legion.
It's easy to do. I mean, what's 2 hours out of your day?
2 hours is how much time Fournier spends each day commuting to work from Berkeley to Boston.
It's time that I would be wasting. I was brought up to use every moment that I have.
The Poppy Lady's got it down to a science, but for Fournier, it's something more spiritual.
This is green and black. Black describes the death, and the green is the life of a veteran or a soldier. We put it in the shepherd's hook. Then we take 4 blood red petals. One represents the Father, one represents the Son, one represents the Holy Ghost. And God will wrap his arms around the veteran for eternity.
She says the Legion wrapped its arms around her family. 2 of her brothers served in Vietnam. One was seriously injured. Fournier's been giving back ever since.
Like I said, I just like doing what I do.
Her goal is 100,000 flowers each year. Altogether, she's made 3 million poppies for American Legion volunteers to distribute for donations across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Putting her hands to work.
They're short and stubby, but they work wonderfully.
Never refusing a donation. Never missing a chance to remind others.
Our freedom is not free.
This small flower represents something so much bigger.
I don't have a lot of money, but I have time. And that 2 hours that I'm on the train is time I can give to my veterans.
The Poppy Lady, God bless her. As we pay tribute to the brave men and women who have proudly served our country this Memorial Day weekend, we'll take you to a special luncheon where one of the first female Marines was honored